who fought boldly at the table. Our LRA strategic plan includes diversity, equity, and inclusion category that challenges the organization to create organizational spaces with the goal of exchanging perspectives, building understanding, and creating equity. In 2016, LRA endorsed the role of literacy research in racism and racial violence, which asserts issues of racism are not peripheral to literacy research, and literacy research need not remain peripheral to issues of racism. The Literacy Research Association resolves that we will not ignore issues of racism and become complicit in the perpetuation of racial inequities, neither in the field nor in the organization itself. This year, in June 2020, LRA stood in solidarity with a statement co-authored by LRA's leadership team that stated, "We are deeply saddened by the continued tragedies incurred disproportionately by our Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. We cannot sit by in silence. We call for renewed dedication for our scholarly talents to call out racism and injustices and support equitable, inclusive, anti-racist educational practices and spaces." Communities worldwide continue to experience social unrest tied to anti-Black violence and anti-Black racism. Folks from all walks of life have taken to the streets to call for change. To kick off our Conference 2020 Collaborative Discussion Series, our esteemed panel of Black researchers will lead a candid discussion. We appreciate your presence here today. It strengthens our organization's resolve to actualize one of the goals in our strategic plan, which calls for us to promote collaborative research that is ethical, rigorous, methodological, diverse, and socially responsible. And today, we will specifically center our focus on this belief that Black lives matter as we collaborate for impact.
I have no idea what's going on. Can you
For
turn
this
yours up
afternoon
without-
is Dr. Yuri Bauer from University of South Carolina.
Thank you, Gwen. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. We have a wonderful session planned for you. As Gwen mentioned, I'm Yuri C. Bauer, professor and the John E. Swearingen Chair of Education at the University of South Carolina. And I am honored to be on this panel with these wonderful colleagues. As many of you might have noticed, the editorial team for JLR began a conversation in our last issue about Black lives. Given the turmoil that we have experienced as a country surrounding George Floyd's and Breonna Taylor's death and many others, we felt compelled to do something, to say something. We do not believe our action will be the cure for anything, but felt we needed to have an unapologetic discussion around what it means to be Black in this country, and the way literacy researchers can engage in research discussions toward change. This session extends the conversation we started via JLR with scholars who have dedicated their academic careers to these issues and those who are up and coming stars. As I reflected on what the US is going through and its impact on Black lives, I found myself thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois. He said, "Nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all of this so far as the truth is ascertainable?" So today is an opportunity. Let's think about our truth and speak our truth about Black lives. So let me give you a sense of this panel and how we're going to structure the session. I will ask 4 of the panelists to introduce themselves, and they'll have 1 minute or less to do so. I will then pose 4 questions to them. The 5th panelist will then introduce himself and provide a summary on these issues. This will be followed by a discussion led by your questions. So please do submit your questions in the chat. We will end with Dr. Carol Lee sharing some closing remarks. So let's get started and get into the discussion. So we'll start with Dr. Winter Hoyt, who will introduce herself. She'll have 1 minute or less to do so. I will start the clock right now.
Hello, my name is Kamanya. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. One of my most recent articles is in JLR. I co-authored it with a first grade teacher, and the title of that is Hey Black Child, Do You Know Who You Are? Using African Diaspora Literacy to Humanize Blackness in Early Childhood Education. Thank you for having me.
And Dr. Gaston, would you please introduce yourself?
You're on mute, Ms. Gaston.
Once again, thank you, Yuri. My name is Vivian Gadsden. I'm a professor, the William T. Carter Professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the Graduate School of Education. And I will tell you a bit more about my work in subsequent questions.
Thank you. And Dr. Lee, would you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Carol Lee, and I am a professor emeritus from the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University, the Learning Sciences program, and I am currently the president-elect of the National Academy of Education.
Thank you. And Dr. Kroom, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. And the best way to introduce myself is to share my mission. I'm committed to cultivating more human fulfillment and mitigating human suffering. In my scholarship, this mission is carried out by focusing on human fulfillment that is thwarted or human suffering that is increased by anti-Black and anti-human race practices. I advance my mission by disrupting harmful race practices and by supporting the development of racial literacies for all. I hope that this panel conversation helps us find ways to collaborate around cultivating more human fulfillment and mitigating human suffering in the racialized situation in which we find ourselves at this point in human history.
Thank you, Dr. Kroom. So let's go ahead and start with a few questions. Dr. Winter Hoyt, can you, in 2 minutes, share with us what you're currently working on?
Sure, I am working on 2 co-authored books. One is with Gloria Boutte and Nathaniel Bryan, and that's going to focus on teaching Black children in early childhood education settings through a pro-Black approach. We will be unapologetically Black in this book. I'm very excited about it. And the second one is another co-authored piece, and we're going to write for elementary teachers on how to be anti-racist, particularly in their literacy instruction. I have a co-authored document that I'm working with colleagues at USC, helping higher education institutions identify and disrupt anti-Blackness. And lastly, I'm always working in the field with in-service and pre-service teachers on how to identify and dismantle anti-Blackness.
Wonderful. All right, Dr. Gaston, would you share with us what you're working on?
Well, my work continues to focus on those broad areas of children, youth, and families in extremely marginalized communities. I think the dimension that has changed over time is focusing more directly on communities, but still thinking across the life course and intergenerationally, with a particular focus on the ways in which racialized identities, social histories, and problems of historical exclusion have affected these families. I have 4 quick projects. One focuses on parents of young children, trying to change the metrics by which local policymakers actually measure the needs of children and families in Philadelphia. That's a part of a current title that I have, which is co-faculty director of an initiative that cuts across education, social policy and practice, and nursing that's called Penn Futures at the University of Pennsylvania. I also have a project that's called the Literacies of Civic Engagement with young people in Philadelphia and across the country. They're looking at questions of civic engagement, but also the ways in which civic engagement is embedded in the ways that we have constructed the politics in the United States and questions of racial disparities. They are doing wonderful projects, looking in their communities, trying to make those communities better, and have done just an incredible job. And the last two will result in books. One is a project on, in which folks are focused on health literacy, and they're doing ethnographies of their own communities, with a book to come out of that, and another on children of incarcerated parents. So I'm very eager. These are all wonderful projects with my graduate students.
Thank you. Sounds fascinating. All right, Dr. Lee, would you please share with us what you've been working on?
Well, I'm currently heading a project with the National Academy of Education on the role of public education and work in communities and preparing young people to engage in civic reasoning and debate. So Vivian will be talking.
You have to talk. Didn't know that.
And which may have some implications for the work that scholars in LRA do, because we are talking about the ways in which the demands of civic reasoning are implicated in literacy and across all subject matters that are taught in the context of schooling. I've also recently, along with Naila Nazir, president of the Spencer Foundation, Roy P. from Stanford, and Maxine McKinney de Royston from Penn, on Handbook on Cultural Foundations of Learning, where we've tried to sort of pull together synthesizing research that captures the full complexity of human learning and development. I recently finished a project that I want to start publishing on. Was a 4-year longitudinal study at an African-centered high school in Chicago, where we were able to document relationships between a positive racial identity, developing competence in literary reasoning, and general reading, outcomes, if you will, based on my work in cultural modeling. And then finally, that which I'm most proud of is the work that I've been doing for the last 50 years in Chicago in building independent Black institutions with my husband, Hakeem Adabudi, poet, Third World Press, which is now 53 years old, the Institute of Positive Education, which is close to 50 years old, and our New Concept School, which is 48 years old, and our 2 charter schools, Betty Shabazz International Charter Schools, which are 21 years old now, where we try to take the kinds of things that we've all sort of been doing really and put them in practice, and can see the fruit of our labor in young people who are unabashedly proud of themselves and see themselves as agentive citizens in the world.
Thank you. And Dr. Kroom, would you share with us what you've been working on?
Currently, I'm publishing about practice of race theory and the post-white orientation as applied to various aspects of teaching and learning. I'm also designing a follow-up study to learn about how teacher educators conceptualize race as compared with my previous study with literacy teachers. Additionally, I'm collaborating with scholars to publish about and fund work that advances the development of racial literacies in the US. And 2 in particular, I want to mention Alex and Christy, who are working with me right now for a special application that we hope will be successful. So looking forward again to collaborating with anyone who's interested in doing work along these lines.
Thank you. All right, so let's go back to Dr. Winter-Hoyt. Can you talk about something that you think is being handled well, or at least you can see a positive outcome anyway, in literacy research from the perspective of Black Lives Matter?
One thing that is going on really well is the heightened interest and awareness of Black Lives Matter in literacy research, like the calls out for submissions, webinars, the conference focus. I really enjoy the books and the scholarship that's coming out. I think about April Baker Bell's work, where she centers and honors African-American language. Goldie just published a co-author piece in Theory into Practice, and she's drawing from Black women and educational theorists. So definitely the heightened interest and awareness of Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Gaston, what do you think? Something that you think is being handled well.
Yes, I'm sorry, I had to unmute. Well, I'm just delighted to see the visibility of people of color in LRA. I can't tell you what a shift that is compared to my years of right out of graduate school. So that's, I think, one of the main things. But I will say that there are other things as well. Literacy research does not always address well enough the problems associated, I think, with the historical nature of white supremacy. And I think there is movement, and we see, as we were just told, Goldie, my colleagues at Penn, and others who are thinking more expansively and using a range of networks. We're seeing the inclusion of new networks that are leading to new understandings of what everyday problems are. We are seeing new conceptualizations of research problems to be addressed. Fortunately, we're also seeing new methodological things and new methods being used and accepted that help us understand the issues from multiple vantage points. And I would say lastly, just strategic and informed integration of knowledge from other disciplines, where these issues have not been addressed sufficiently either, but in many ways have been more forward thinking than perhaps we might have been in both literacy and education more broadly defined.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Lee, what are your thoughts on what's going well in literacy research from the perspective of Black lives?
Well, I think work in our literacy organizations, LRA and National Council of Teachers of English, in mentoring emerging scholars of color, the STAR program at LRA, Cultivating the Voices, which I was one of the spirited people trying to bring it about some 20 years ago, I think has had a significant impact in terms of the development of leadership in the field in literacy research. For example, the sort of expansion of culturally responsive pedagogy to culturally humanizing pedagogy. Maisha Wynn, Django Paris all came out of CMV, for example. I also think that the sort of building on Vivian's point, the cutting edge work that I think that is occurring, and we've tried to address this in this handbook on cultural foundations of learning, is understanding, for example, that learning literacy or literate acts are not simple cognitive processes in individual brains, but rather are an outgrowth that is influenced by participation in cultural practices, including the diversity of ways in which these practices unfold. A lot of people here have done work documenting those processes, understanding the role of development, where life course learners are, understanding the importance of perceptions of self, of others, of tasks, of the emotional salience that we attribute to experience as influencing things like motivation and persistence, and the ways in which this understanding of human learning and development in terms of our interest with literacy at the center sits inside of complex dynamic systems that pose very interesting new challenges for us to try to tackle as researchers, and also in terms of how we think about issues of assessment.
Thank you, thank you. Dr. Kroom.
So actually the comments that you all just heard from Dr. Lee and Dr. Gaston really underscore what I'm thinking. And so the thing that I think that literacy research is handling well requires me to specify what I have in mind when I say literacy research. And so when I say literacy research, I'm thinking particularly of Black scholars and other scholars who have followed the lead of Black scholars in the field of literacy research. And in that literacy research, that's what I'm referring to. In that literacy research, there's already a clear record that makes it impossible to say that LRA or literacy scholars across the world haven't had the opportunity to critically engage with race or to critique narrow notions of literacy research, as you just heard. And so there's a long list of literacy researchers who have been doing exactly this for a long time. And that literacy research has left us with an archive that should inform our entire field as now that we're focusing on Black Lives Matter, and especially since the murder of George Floyd has gotten LRA's attention and really indeed the whole world's attention, so to speak. So the thing that, in summary, that I feel that the literacy research field has done well is that Black scholars and other scholars who have followed their lead have managed to leave us an archive, even if it was not highlighted and heralded as much as it deserved to be. They nonetheless resisted, and they would not allow that grand tradition that has sustained us and that the world is looking for right now. They insisted that that archive be built and be regarded and institution building, as we just heard about STAR. I am also a CMV fellow. There's so many examples of this going way, way back into the early period of literacy research, where no one can rightly and accurately claim that you haven't had a peer in your period, in your time, who was concerned about the kinds of issues that we're revisiting now.
Okay. Well, we've talked about what's going well, and of course, you know what's coming next, right? So talk about something that bugs you right now concerning the way that research is or is not being done, with an understanding that Black lives matter. So let's start again with Dr. Winterhoyt.
So my answer for this kind of ties into what we were just talking about and what the panelists said about the long history and the archive of Black greatness. So I wonder if this heightened like interest is performative. Like, how authentic is it? How systemic is it? So, okay, we have this great platform, which I'm very grateful for, but how are researchers, educators, how are they sustaining Black Lives Matter, right? What systemic changes are being made? So this is just not a movement, right? This is something that we are going to put into policy. So something that bugs me right now is this heightened interest performative, or is it going to really create institutional changes?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dr. Gaston?
I think Mania is completely on target. I think that despite the shifts, there is still an enormous need to deepen our knowledge, to understand and to figure out what the interpretive lenses are that people are using to understand what Black Lives Matter might mean. You know, in our field, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was such a shift to metacognition and thinking about sociocognitive issues, and then sociocultural and cultural practices. And what that work did was that it told the field that there was another way to consider how individuals learn and become vested in learning. Is there openness to these other frameworks as we speak? Are they well enough grounded? Whose work counts? And how are they being applied to the lives of Black children? And so I think that while we have made strides, we have a distance still to go. If in fact literacy and the work of researchers of literacy will be really grounded in a moral and ethical question or context, and a belief in a society of justice for all.
Thank you. Dr. Lee?
I think that we continue to, despite what I think are very compelling, broader ecological context under which we understand human learning and development, with literacy as one instance, we are still very much as a field informed by negative assumptions about people and youth who are not designated as white. And I'll say more about that a little later. So in the midst of the pandemic and the concerns about the challenges of remote learning, you hear the term cognitive loss, which suggests that they're not talking about, rich white kids in the suburbs. And the use, as opposed to saying learning loss or loss of skills or something to that effect, the broad use of the term cognitive loss suggests some sort of broader impairment that, that has evolved, that I think sits inside of a big meta narrative that we wrestle with, certainly as a country and certainly in our field of research. We still haven't moved beyond, even though we had empirical findings to the contrary about issues around language. So the work back in the 70s on dialect interference with reading comprehension of young children, although not explicit, is still a kind of underlying kind of meta set of assumptions. The Hart and Risley, that 1,000, whatever it is, number of words poor kids are supposed to have when they come to school, still, has great currency in the field. John Odbu's work of extrapolating, Black kids don't want to learn because they think it's acting white, based on a study he did in one neighborhood in California and Signathia Fordham did in one high school in DC. There are, and the ways in which I think teaching is being commercially situated as a bag of tricks. So if you do this thing or that thing that somebody got some funding to do and got some statistical significance with whatever their sample was, that this set of tricks is sufficient to deal with the complexity of what it means to teaching, and the ways in which teaching is not reified and systematically supported as an intellective endeavor, and endeavor of lifelong learning. And finally, I would say the restrictive way of assessments that are currently used for accountability. I'm on the NAEP development, vision and development panel for revising the 2025 reading framework. And one of the things we have recommended is that instead of NAEP reporting simply by race and then SES, that they report about differentiation within ethnicity by SES in order to account for differentiation in ethnic communities, and trying to capture in survey items issues having to do with kids' perceptions of themselves and of their school climates and all that. And what we're getting is this pushback, interestingly enough, from conservative people in the field, if you will, that says you're just trying to make the test easy so poor kids and Black kids, kids of color, quote unquote, can pass the test. So I'm just saying there continues to be an underlying set of deficit meta-narratives that inform very much of what comes through in terms of the support and organization of public education curriculum. We don't have a sufficiently robust way of understanding what does it mean in literacy of teaching, whatever the domains we're having kids read about, in ways that are indeed authentic, as opposed to saying we're going to put some little special thing in there because we're progressive for the colored kids or the Latinx kids or whatever the case may be.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Kroom, would you like to share with us your thoughts?
Yeah, it bugs me that the common sense view of race and the deficiency philosophy that Dr. Lee and many others, I might add, have referenced over many years, again, back to that archive, it bugs me that the common sense view of race and the deficiency philosophy, which typically accompanies this racial view, is still the default racial view among researchers, let alone what non-specialists may think about race, or what policymakers or practitioners may assume that race is causing all by itself as a thing in itself in literacy and in education. And what you just heard from Dr. Lee really begins to move in that direction in terms of talking about those effects. So for example, in a more specific case of the theme tonight, for example, if Black Lives Matter, what is Black? And more importantly, what is race? That's a question that we don't spend enough time on as a field. And even some Black researchers are unclear about how to answer these kinds of questions. So it is no big surprise that non-Black researchers are also unclear. Okay, so now I want to make it clear, make no mistake, answering these questions should not lead to any form of post-racialism. That's not where this is going. Answering these questions should lead and result in developing racial literacies. That's what this is about. And so that's where the urgency around my point about all of us needing to develop racial literacies comes from, whether you're a specialist, non-specialist, whether you're racially Black or racially non-Black.
Thank you. Our last question. Can you make a recommendation concerning an area of research that needs exploring in order to push the field forward from the perspective of Black Lives Matters? So we'll start again with Dr. Winterhoy.
My first and really only recommendation is to decenter whiteness, right? So as researchers, how do we utilize the work of Black scholars to transform literacy education? What counts as research? Who are we citing, right? And not just, I'm only gonna cite Black scholars who are talking about issues of race. There are Black scholars who were researching family and communities, who were talking about the arts and literacy education, who are talking about gender fluidity. So how, like, what is your quote unquote canon? And what are you using when you're teaching your doctoral programs? Whose geniuses are you drawing on and who informs your work? So my main recommendation is to decenter whiteness.
Okay. Dr. Gaston, same question, recommendations.
Yeah. So I would begin by saying that we can't change what we don't know. And so at a minimum, I would love for people to take a look, a very critical look at the agenda and the writings by people who are doing work around Black Lives Matter. That would be a beginning point. But I have this vision of people studying Black children as Black children, not in comparison to white children. Understanding the whole child, centering the work on what Black children and youth and adults know, doing a better job of uncovering what they know, taking the historical work of cultural practices and social processes seriously, but coupling it with some of the more recent cutting edge work on racial equity and racial disparities and related topics. I think of earlier, Carol mentioned Maisha and some of the others, Karina and my own colleague, Ebony Thomas. These people are doing really interesting work that brings up both the historical context and the urgency of the contemporary moment. But I'd like that work to be centered. I'd like to see more of the work in literacy be centered on issues of race as both an historical and a contemporary phenomenon that is complex and trying to interrogate that complexity in a way that I think we have not thus far.
Okay, thank you. What do you think, Dr. Lee?
Well, building on Marcus and Vivian's comments, I think that it is essential. I try to look in terms of literacy research from a human development perspective, and to understand that the assertion that Black Lives Matter is not an assertion about whether Black Lives Matter. It's an assertion about a political system. Because the question of whether Black Lives Matter is not a question. It's absurd to even imply that they don't. And that race operates not as a cultural construct, it operates as a political construct and sits and it unfolds inside of structures and systems that have to be interrogated in order to dismantle. And therefore it becomes an interesting question as to how we think about our research through the lens of dismantling these structures and dismantling the assumptions of this ideology. It's an ideology of white supremacy. The ideology of white supremacy does not necessarily mean people are walking around with Ku Klux Klan hats on and saying, I hate Black people. The problem is the assumptions that underlie it are so normalized as to not be visible except when you have these outrageous actions like the video of this man killing George Floyd, knowing that he was being videotaped, which bring back the memories from me as a child when I was 10 years old and looking in Jet magazine, seeing the picture of Emmett Till, who had been killed, or thinking back to the opening issue of the Crisis magazine coming out of NAACP in 1910, 1911, with data about the 3,000 plus lynchings in the last couple of decades prior to that. And the question then, for me, is for us as literacy researchers, is what role does enabling the development of complex literacies on the part of, let's say, young people, whoever in the school context, as well as for adults, to learn how to interrogate the assumptions of this system, which is based on a set of schizophrenic absurdities that seem normal because they are reinforced through systems. Then there's the question of basic research about understanding the diversity of pathways, let's just say in terms of literacy in children and adolescents, the diversity of pathways through which human beings learn to become literate, as opposed to the assumptions that we currently have that there's a single pathway. If you don't know the ABCs when you come to kindergarten, you're not gonna learn how to read, which is absurd. So for me, it's just the need to develop new conceptual and methodological tools that really get at the heart of what it is we're operating against.
Wonderful. Lots of interesting and wonderful ideas on which to build on. So now we're going to switch a little bit and let Dr. Watson share with us his thoughts on what he's heard thus far.
Well, thank you very much. And hi, everyone. I'm Vaughn Watson, Assistant Professor of English Education at Michigan State University. And thank you, panelists. Thank you, esteemed panel. Dr. Winterhoyt, you prompted us to build with what's going well, pointing to the heightened interest and awareness of Black Lives Matter, and to consider closely this work as institutional change, as more than performative. Dr. Gadsden, you guided us to consider the inclusion of new networks leading to new understandings of everyday research problems, new methodological frames and new methods, and the possible and present future-oriented work of the application of these frames and methods toward justice for all. And Dr. Kroom, you compelled us to think with Black scholars and additional scholars who have followed their lead to build with and extend an archive that may prompt us to inform our entire field, how we may continue the work and shift of a commonplace deficit narrative of race, and the urgent interplay then of race and literacy toward a collective development as the work of racial literacy. And Dr. Lee, you called us to think boldly with building institutions, putting into practice young people who are unabashedly proud and see themselves as agentive citizens in the world, building with and extending the urgency of such mentoring initiatives as the LRA STARS program and NCT's Cultivating New Voices, to think with and beyond cognitive approaches to literacy learning, to engage the interplay of human learning and development and complex dynamic systems of culture, life course development, and perceptions of self. How may we talk back to the underlying set of deficit meta-narratives that hold implications for literacy teaching and learning? And Dr. McMillan compelled us to visit with, in our opening remarks, with LRA ideals, as Dr. McMillan noted, of exchanging perspectives, building understandings, and creating equity, to envision boldly equitable, inclusive, anti-racist practices and spaces. What may it mean as literacy researchers in literacy research to engage in this way, to do this work across methodologies and theoretical frameworks and systems, I returned to W.E.B. Du Bois, with whom Dr. Bauer opened our session. And I share a notion that Dr. Michelle Knight Manuel and I think of, and the esteemed panel has provided us with urgent examples of what I think of as diasporic tellings. Dr. Knight Manuel and I recently discussed how in the remaking and sharing and reflecting of popularized narratives of immigrant youth and young adults from West African countries through literacy practices of the body, we glimpse possibilities for literacy teaching and education when intentionally naming and furthermore historicizing, contextualizing, affirming, and building with the humanity of Black immigrant youth and young adults, what we conceptualize as humanizing the Black immigrant body. And across context and diasporic tellings, Black immigrant youth and young adults discussed and reflected in narratives and artifacts, humanizing the Black immigrant body as an ongoing envisioning, a type of speculative seeing, telling, affirming, and building with lived past, presence, and future possibilities of recognizing the humanity of Black bodies. By speculative seeing, we reference the unpublished story authored between 1908 and 1910 by W.E.B. Du Bois, titled The Princess Steel. In this 14-page manuscript located in 2015 in Du Bois' collections by Adrian Brown and Britt Russard, Du Bois composed the character of a Black sociologist who invented the machinery of the megascope, a type of viewfinder shaped to resemble a shining trumpet affixed with head and eye and ear and handpieces, through which a viewer glimpsed across space and time. The story's protagonist, peering through the megascope, viewed an African princess, hair made of steel, who had been kidnapped and separated from her mother, a metaphor of colonization and exploitation of Africa. Brown and Russert observed that Du Bois' genre work does more than challenge stereotypes with its Black characters. It also reveals racial archetypes propping up these genres. And so humanizing the Black immigrant body as such speculative seeing, to provide one more example, is the artist Kehinde Wiley, whose father is Nigerian. Wiley painting the official portrait of former US President Barack Obama, son of a Kenyan immigrant, unveiled in portrait on permanent display in the Smithsonian National Port Galleries, American President's Exhibit. Wiley portrays Obama seated against a backdrop of foliage. Jasmine symbolizes Hawaii, Obama's birth state. Chrysanthemums reflect the official flower of the city of Chicago. African blue lilies appear illustrative of Obama's father's Kenyan heritage. And President Obama told the gathered crowd of journalists and portraits and politicians at the portrait's unveiling, he says, "What I was always struck by whenever I saw Kehinde's portraits was the degree to which they challenged our conventional views of power, wealth, privilege, and the way that he would take extraordinary care and precision and vision in recognizing the beauty and grace and the dignity of people and put them on a grand stage." And so ways we may envision and think with our literacy teaching and learning, our methodologies, and our theoretical frameworks. Brown and Russert noted that Du Bois offered ways of imagining historical change, a creative mode ready to be used in the present to disrupt the nationalist tenor as this ongoing work of speculative seeing.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. And I think given what you've just said, I think the timing is perfect to open it up and get some more voices into the discussion. So people have had an opportunity to hear from each of you. So now let's hear from the audience in terms of what they're thinking. So I have one question that's for Dr. Lee. It says, you noted that we have this history that shows many decades of research and theory in literacy research and in your own work that shows that literacy sits inside a complex set of systems and is culturally situated, not just individual brains or individuals themselves. So why aren't educational or literacy researchers making more of an impact on schools and on the lives of children? Why do schools still seem to situate children as individuals and literacy primarily as a cognitive process?
So one of the issues when I was AERA president back in 2010, as Vivian was in some other years, I don't remember what years, that we wrestled with was that we were enmeshed in all of this research in context of AERA across disciplines and topic areas, but had great difficulty impacting policy and systems. So I think that one of the targets for LRA as an organization, and for those who are interested, is to really try to understand political systems and how they learn. They do not operate on the basis of logic, and they do not operate on the basis of empirical evidence. You can think back the days of, I forget what it was, what the big reading initiative I think IES had, and there was a decoding versus whole language. And the decoding people won out because they had a stronger political machinery to influence public policy. They produced all these diagnostic assessments and curriculum and PD. And then finally, years later, they did a study of impact. And what did they find? Yes, decoding got better, comprehension wasn't impacted at all. So I think one of the complexities of what we're dealing with is, one, ourselves being able to understand ourselves and our work, and to communicate to broader public audiences this complex system of learning and development, and the ways in which diversity in the evolution of the human species is its advantage. It's not its disadvantage. That's the reason we survive, is because we are adapted. The viruses with which we are at war are smarter in some sense than we are, because they are constantly adapting, right, to changes. So the issue of trying to understand how systems operate and what are the mechanisms to influence them, which I think is very much directed to the whole Black Lives Movement on the one hand, and at the same time doing that in a way that finds a way to help stakeholders begin to interrogate this ideology that permeates historically and today our society in ways that are safe. Because if they feel attacked, all people are going to do is push back.
Thank you. We have a question that goes out now to all of you. Says, what do you see as the role of white scholars in advancing a Black Lives Matter literacy research agenda? Who would like to start?
Can I just add a comment to this? And that is the issue of the challenge of white supremacy as an ideology are the ways in which its fundamental assumptions are so normalized as to not be questioned. So the question of who gets to be Black and who gets to be white, to understand that these are arbitrary attributions. There's a book called When the Irish Became White. When they first came over, the Anglo-Saxon folks said they weren't white. They were lynching, the English were lynching the Irish in Ireland before they got here. Before they started lynching us, they were lynching each other. They were lynching the Irish. So there's something about this whole question of what does it mean to be Black, right? Versus ethnicity. What does it mean to be a person of African descent? You got people who are quote unquote white who are Yoruba priests. What does that mean? Just to complicate the waters a little bit.
You did, that's good. Others, what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
You can respond to Dr. Lee, or you can add your own.
I guess it's a little of both. I want to thank Carol for, I want to thank you, Carol, for what you said. I think that, and I know that book well, How the Irish Became White. And when we look at the kind of chronicling of multiculturalism, for instance, in this country, we know that lots of people who are now considered white were not white at the turn of the 20th century. And so definitions of, it just lets you know, as Carol said, the arbitrariness of even the construct of whiteness. And yet it has such power. The other thing is to just be reminded that we talk about systemic barriers and we talk about systems, but systems are constituted by people who come with their own beliefs, their own histories, their own strengths and their own insecurities, and they then create many of those barriers. And so I think when we ask, what is the role of a white, I think, what was it, researcher, that it?
Yeah.
And I think one would be to try to perhaps not think about being a white researcher. What is the driving force that makes your role in this field important? What is it that drives any of us to engage in the kinds of teaching and learning that can move us toward a more equitable society? What are the understandings that we need? What is the knowledge that we need? How do we move from spaces of comfort to places of discomfort? And how do we really kind of wallow in those spaces of discomfort so that we can come out to be better and more knowledgeable? How do we challenge the status quo? Even when we think we're right, how do we create that space that says perhaps we're not quite as right as we thought we were? How do we look at the text that we have embraced as as the most important text in the world? How do we interrogate those in a way that may make us feel uncomfortable because we have always revered those texts? How do we bring into our sphere of influence other kinds of work that allows us to create a more enlightened perspective, not just of Black Lives Matter, but of the incredible expanse of possibilities that exists in the world?
Dr. Watson, what are your thoughts? Thank you so much. Dr. Watson, what are your thoughts on this?
I was thinking with the perspective of youth, in my case, with particularly Black youth with whom I teach and learn, and thinking about what it means to, as a starting place, starting place, to lead with a notion of strengths and to work with and across this notion of designing with, teaching with, building with, working with. And so when I'm thinking with pre-service teachers, and in my context, primarily white pre-service teachers, this is, I think, an urgent starting point. What does it mean to rethink our whether it's our methodological approaches, our teaching stances, our starting points, in ways that deeply affirm and honor, contextualize and extend the lived experiences and literacy practices of our youth and communities. And so, that's for me, a starting point is and then also continually thinking about, I remember when I was a high school teacher, I taught high school English for 12 years in Brooklyn. And, you used to have this notion that the students' day began and ended at your class, right? And so it's like, students had whatever it was, 7 other classes to go to. And so I'm also, I guess what I'm noting there is thinking with the idea that what does it mean then to also build and affirm and extend the experiences and practices of youth and their families and communities, and for us to continually just keep rethinking the starting point. And then I think parallel to that is, as we're engaging our work, thinking with frameworks that again affirm particularly the lived experiences and literacy practices of youth, and in my case, so it's thinking with I'm working particularly in this case, if I'm working with with immigrant youth from West African countries, what are notions, how do we rethink what notions of learning as lifelong, notions of learning as extending across spaces and time frames, working with elders and these sets of points. And, you know, it compels us, and we heard some of these framings with the panelists. It compels us to think about and think with different starting points for what we may mean for with literacy practices and communities of practice and things with families and elders and that sort of thing. So that would be my starting point. I share with pre-service teachers we have to listen deeply with and seek to build with. And then we can extend that out and think about our research frameworks and participatory ways in the ways that we move from there.
Can I just add to the question?
Sure. Yes, yes.
For white researchers in the field, I would say start with self, right? Because and this is not just for white researchers, this is for everyone, because we've all been racialized into this world. So we have to think about how we have internalized racism if we're a person of color, right? And how whiteness have impacted us if you're a white person, to not be a part of the white savior, white hope kind of approach. And think about how you're using your privilege, right? Are you mentoring Black junior scholars, okay? What are you willing to give up for the betterment, not for Black people, but for humanity? This is a humanity issue, and it's not gonna take just us Black scholars like dismantling anti-Blackness. It's gonna have to be everyone involved. So what are you willing to give up for the betterment of humanity?
Dr.
If I could add a thought, I would just invite us to do a small thought experiment. And the point is not to devalue the white racial category. The thought experiment is, how would you feel if there were no value, no significance at all to the racial category white? That's the thought experiment that I want you to sit with. Because fuchsia within our logics, our racial logics, doesn't ring a bell, so to speak. It doesn't draw anything in terms of meaning or significance or anything like that, right? So what if the racial category white was just not significant at all, where all the things that have been invested in making white and producing white as if it is above all other ways of thinking about race, and whiteness as above anything that's not regarded as white? What if that were not the way the world functioned? How would you feel about that? And so if you feel nervous, or if you feel concerned, or if you feel deflated, or you feel as if your world has been snatched out from under your feet, that begins to tell you what investment you have in whiteness. And by the way, you can have that kind of investment in whiteness even if you're not regarded yourself as white. So if whiteness were simply insignificant, if whiteness, let's imagine it never existed as a significant racial category at all. If there's any investment in you around that, that's important for you to think about and pay attention to with regard to where your commitments may lie. And then those commitments get played out in your practices in all sorts of ways, through the way you use language, through the choices that you make with regard to relationships. It plays out in all those different ways and all those different degrees. And so that's a way, a quick way of trying to get at what I'm referring to when I talk about a post-white orientation, where in every way, across modes, across levels, in every way, white and whiteness is demoted from the place it had no place in being in from the very beginning. So that's what I would offer our fellow white researchers, is to really examine the extent to which you are invested in the idea and in the political and in the associational and all these other ways that whiteness pays wages, to pull something from critical race theory, right? And also Du Bois before that. The point is, what are your investments in that, and to what extent are you really, really deeply hooked into whatever that's about?
Lots to think about. lots to think about. And certainly the aim here was to start a conversation, not to fix everything. We cannot, but if we all take part in these conversations and commit to doing it and engaging in it long term, and to struggle through those hard questions, I think we're better off than where we're currently at. So let's take a moment and shift a little bit, and I'll turn the floor to Dr. Lee to share with us some of her closing thoughts.
Well, I'll try to be very brief because I think we are a few minutes over time, right? And there's a town hall or something to follow. I want to just make two broad comments. I think that one of the important opportunities of this moment, reflected certainly in this session, is for us as communities to really begin to interrogate the fundamental construct of race. That if you look in terms of human history, this is a relatively new construct in human history. The Greeks and the Egyptians were not talking about race. It didn't exist. There's no biological basis for it. The evolution, as Vivian was saying, about who gets to be in this category at any given moment in time is purely political. And so one of the goals, it seems to me, for us as communities of scholars to tackle the challenges that we're facing, one is to understand these are not new challenges. These are persistent challenges, and they remain not because of basic problems of human development, but because of basic problems in how political systems operate, and to understand that the people operating those systems are human beings, where principles that we understand about how to deal with issues of implicit bias and conceptual change can inform how we work with one another, how we try to influence policymakers, teachers, ourselves, et cetera. To not assume that skin color designates an ideological orientation. We have our gentleman on the Supreme Court right now that many of us have lots of questions about, despite the melanin in his skin. So I think my other comment is, I keep bringing back to this human development perspective. Margaret Beale Spencer, I always tell her she should pay me because I'm her PR person, has developed this framework she calls PVEST, Phenomenological Variant of Ecological Systems Theory. And one of the most powerful aspects that come out of this is the notion that to be human is to be at risk. To assume that because of the melanin of the amount of melanin you have in your skin, in and of itself poses in a structure sets of challenges. But people of African descent who were enslaved, who experienced challenges that we cannot even imagine, got up every day and imagined us. Wall Street used to be a grave site where enslaved Africans buried their dead. The Schomburg Center for Black Culture pushed, 10, 15 years ago to have it recognized nationally. They won that. There's a beautiful monument in Wall Street that you can see. They also then had archaeologists from Howard University to dig up remains. And what they found, people were in ill health, which they expected, but what they didn't, as people were buried with markings on the body in positions and with amulets that said, I'm Yoruba, I'm not a slave, I'm a Khan. You know what I mean? So to get out of this web, we all got to push back. We human, we this, all that. That's what, every time you get into that, you get caught in that web, right? Versus an assumption that to be human is to be at risk, and what supports your ability to deal with those risks is the nature of the supports that are built around you. And that's what our job is in our literacy research, particularly working with young people, is to create structures and dispositions and senses of identity that help them to be able to filter through these meta narratives. If this doesn't have anything to do with me, they got a problem, not me.
Mhm.
Finally, I would say, as I had mentioned to Gwen when we talked yesterday, I think this is a period that opens up wonderful opportunities for LRA as an association. There's a new administration, thank God, coming. Thank the people that voted, thank the Black women that came out to vote for him. A new administration. We don't know who the Secretary of Education is going to be, but an association of this standing, I think LRA and IRA and NCT, we ought to come together in terms of coming up with recommendations about systems of support that need to be in place and organize ourselves with the practitioner communities and families, et cetera, to try to really influence that system. And then finally, I would say creating as an organization spaces that can develop scholars to try new methodologies, to learn new theories. My training was in curriculum instruction. I ended up in a learning sciences program with a bunch of cognitive psychologists, ended up for 10 years co-teaching a seminar with colleagues in human development, and opened up a whole new world that I didn't know anything about, before. And it has been powerful for me in terms of being able to develop new theories, new methodologies, sort of push the bounds of our work, because the work that we do as social scientists essentially is supposed to have explanatory power. It's supposed to be able to explain and influence things that actually happen in the world. And most of us don't have spaces within our individual institutions to have the sort of resources and supports for doing that. So just in closing comment, I would just say is let us all learn how to interrogate this system of thought and its underpinnings, and understand that it is illogical and it is arbitrary. It only explains how it works. It doesn't explain anything about human beings and human potential. And that we have a wonderful opportunity at this moment in time to develop work that we do in the world, especially taking the world into the world of practice. That's why we've been building these independent African-centered institutions for half a century, for 50 years now, and they're still alive and well. And the product, as the old folks said, the proof is in the pudding, are these young people who are like those people who got buried 400 years ago when somebody thought they owned them. Because I don't use the term slave owner. I use the term people who thought they owned other human beings who've taken up that mantle. Mary McLeod Bethune, let's move on.
This has been fabulous, and I hope others feel that way in terms of what they've heard and so on. I feel badly because there are so many wonderful questions that are left here that we really didn't get to. So if anyone is interested and wants to continue the conversation with us, if it's okay with the panel, we certainly can entertain a couple more, 2 or 3 more questions. Is that okay with folks?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Lady Gwen says it's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Let's continue. Let's seize
All
the
right.
moment.
So I have one question for Dr. Gaston, and it reads, considering the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander describes the disproportionate number of Black males in the criminal justice system, can you talk more about your research in prison?
Well, just to be clear, I was not in prison, but I did study fathers in prison. So this work actually started during the subsequent to the Clinton administration. So I guess that was George W. Bush. Mm-hmm. And the Clinton administration was really a quite interesting period because on the one hand, many people were put in jail. On the other hand, the Justice Department actually had many people who were concerned about the children of prisoners and put new kinds of studies in play. And so the original work really kind of started as a result of that. And we've studied the children and the effects of that kind of father absence. I guess what I've just learned is just the inherent complexity, both of the system as well as of the lives of the men. When I first started doing that work, I didn't really know anything much about incarceration or the correctional institutions. So I then collected every piece of writing that I could find. And I sat in my office at home and I just read everything. And I was just perplexed by the nonsensical nature of so much of what had been going on, and started looking at this is when I brought my quantitative background into play. I took the opportunity to try to look at some of the analyses and compare some of the analyses that had been done. And what we found was a system that was just so inherently unjust. Such differences in sentencing. 60% of children in urban areas and low-income urban areas were said to be growing up with at least one person in the household who had been in prison. And of course, these were disproportionately Black and brown children. And I think what was most compelling for me was what the fathers had to say, but also the ways in which their kids were affected by what happened. In a country that says it cares about children, we had folks who were perfectly fine putting folks away for extended periods of time for certainly breaking the law, but breaking the law in ways that other people who were of higher social status were breaking the law and not being criminalized. And so it was just a I've been really overwhelmed every time I've talked about this work, and as I read Michelle Alexander's book, because I could just see the children who were being affected by the absence of their parents. And I could just think of the folks who were in prison themselves, who, had they been I always use the example of, had they been at Wharton, they would have gotten a slap on the wrist. But of course they weren't at Wharton because we as a society did not do a good enough job to support them in ways that mattered. And we then failed them again by incarcerating them and moving people from society for long periods of time for sometimes serious crimes, but very often for relatively inconsequential crimes for society.
Thank you. All right, let's ask a question that goes out to all of you now. I am concerned about the reality of a divided America in terms of rural versus urban. How do we actualize anti-racist education in rural America, where demographics are clearly changing, but where cultural realities are far from a post-racial reality?
There's no post-racial reality anywhere in the country. One of the things in this project with the National Academy of Education that we're doing on civics is we have a chapter called Lessons Learned, where we try to document the ways in which African American, Native American, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander communities have shown agency in spite of the structural racism that we have consistently faced. But we also added a section on Appalachia. And we did so because we felt that what is interesting in all of our discussions, the two communities that are most absent from our national discussions, underlying the whole set of issues about Black Lives Matter, but even in a broader sense, we don't talk about poor white kids in Appalachia, in the Mississippi Delta, and we don't talk about indigenous families and children. And so the question, I think, goes back to the point I was making earlier about how we think about impacting systems. In the United States, not having a national system of government means that if you want to impact the experiences, for example, of white Appalachian children who have to get on a bus for 2 hours to get to their public school and back, and to try to change the nature of instruction to help them have a sort of broader sense, you know, of what unifies us, you know, as a nation, and the central role of diversity and the special mechanisms in this country to actually support it. You got to convince the Tennessee state legislature, you got to convince the city, the council, whatever it is, for that little region where that little town is. It's a very complex system. That's why I came back saying that one of our tasks is to learn what it means to try to tackle systems, including what does it mean for kids in urban areas to understand the experiences and challenges of kids living in rural areas. And I want to add one other comment to Vivian's comment about the incarceration and the impact on children. One of the things that for me is so powerful about the history of people of African descent in the United States is the way in which we have always found ways to resist, and if you compensate is too strong a term, for the challenges. The question when those policies came into effect is we have to have a dual prong approach. On the one hand, we have to keep, arguing like the NAACP, Du Bois, et cetera, had done to reorganize the systems that sent these Black men largely into jail for these inordinate amounts, compared to other places in the world. Nobody else has, no, I shouldn't say nobody else, but the other quote unquote advanced nations don't have this kind of penal system that we have in the United States on the one hand. But at the same time, something my husband always amounts, if I can go down any street on the south side of Chicago and I'm gonna find 2 or 3 churches. And if nobody is keeping those churches from taking those babies whose daddies are in jail and working to surround them. And we know that if you go back in the Jim Crow era, which was a part of work of Black teachers in Black Jim Crow schools, Vanessa Siddle Walker talks about this, is you could be on that block, and if you couldn't take care of that child right, that old lady down the street was going to intercede on your behalf. That we have to do this complex work, I think, on the one hand, of challenging these structures of oppression on the one hand, and on the other hand, understand they do not determine what happens to us. One of the things I said, I probably shouldn't be saying it on this thing here, is these white supremacist groups are coming up with the guns and everything. They ain't coming into the hood. They're not coming into no poor Black neighborhood because they're gonna meet resistance. We gotta acknowledge in these systems of oppression that we are not simply objects, we are also agents, and we are perfectly capable of pushing and resisting these systems. And if that wasn't possible, none of us on this panel wouldn't be here because the Black people would be gone.
Thank you.
Point well made.
I'm the old lady on the panel.
Mic drop.
Yep.
If I can just swoop the mic up really quick. I think that's a great question that before even answering the question, we have to unpack it. And I think Gloria did a really good job with the dichotomy of rural versus urban and how we use language, right? I think about James Baldwin, who says that when he travels to the South and the North, racism just looks different, but it's still there, right? So then we have to define, like in that question, how are you using racism? Because oftentimes we think about those overt examples, but for me, I'm looking at racism as a system, right? And then for me in my work, I'm looking at anti-Black racism. So I'm thinking about like anti-Blackness and voter suppression, anti-Blackness and the mortality rate of Black mothers in the healthcare system, anti-Blackness and stop and frisk policies. So I'm not thinking about those examples that we see and we can point out racism. I'm talking about, like Beverly Tatum said, racism is the smog that we breathe in every single day and we don't even realize it.
What are you thinking?
Oh, I guess I sighed too loudly. I guess I'm going to just say this. I think that the lines are so blurred between rural and urban now that it's kind of, I know there are some issues that are unique to rural areas. The lack of access to information is pretty stunning. But, you know, earlier this week, Septima Poinsett Clark was honored in the Reading Hall of Fame posthumously. And it was a really powerful event when I realized that she was going to be inducted. Because as a child, as a young child, she was very close to our family. We lived in an area, we lived in the same area. Our folks were part of the literacy campaigns in South Carolina. I saw her, my family saw her often as people were trying to vote, as she and other people went through these small rural communities and also worked in urban areas. And it's rather striking that in this past and over the past 4 years, we've seen a vision of rural America that puts it in battle with what is perceived as urban America. When, as Carol said, the issues of poverty are rampant. The examples of disenfranchisement are often very powerful. And the issues of race, though, somehow manage to be the same. And I think we kind of are pretty dismissive of rural life and rural education. But when I think back to the Miles Horton types and Septima Clark and others, you know, they moved back and forth seamlessly between these areas because they knew change couldn't happen in one or the other. It needed to happen all over. And as Carol has said, these systems of oppression are so huge that we come, and as others have said, we come to accept them as the way that they need, that life should be. And we don't question them because, of course, we don't, they're such a part of who we are, we don't even challenge them. And I think it's imperative for educated people, like the people on this, in this session, to take up the work that challenges the status quo, and to speak back to those who run systems and try to disentangle the problems that are created by systems that ultimately disenfranchise so many people in our society.
I'd like to add a brief comment, and I may be wrong because I don't on a personal level, I don't know much about rural communities. But we had family in the South, and when I was growing up, my mother never took us south at all. But my sense is that rural America is not homogeneous, and that if you look at rural communities, I think in the deep South, you are likely to have Black people and white people living in communities with histories that are both intimate and violent. Mm-hmm. There is, I learned, a Black community in Appalachia. They call them, there's a term for them, I forget, I can't pronounce it, what it is, versus rural areas in the Midwest and places like Iowa or Ohio, for example, where there is much less likely, they're much more likely to be entirely white. So I do think that just as we tend to want to homogenize this construction of race, we also kind of homogenize the rural experience in this country.
I agree, Carol. I would say that there probably are some themes that run through rural areas. Excuse me. And of course, I'm going to have to get up.
While she's, hope she feels better. I just want to add, while she's kind of resetting there, that my thoughts are to bring our attention to how thoroughly racialized and how thoroughly socialized we are into racialization. And I mentioned this in an article that was published online in 2018. Now it's in print in 2020, where urban itself and urban education, the concept of urban education, is a race practice. That the notion of urban education itself is a race practice. And the idea of urban is not about topography. It's about a way of understanding ourselves and making sense of ourselves racially and along the political lines and all the other things, social, et cetera, that we've been talking about tonight. And so the fact that you have Afro-Latino, I think is the term that somebody shared, Kristen shared that. Thank you, Kristen. The fact that you have Afro-Latinos as a way of talking about Black Appalachians, and you don't necessarily need to come up with a new term to talk about the other Appalachians that are there, is another example of the point. Like we always, in marketing and in business, they have the urban market, all right? And when they say the urban market, let's say Chicago. In Chicago, there's an area called the Gold Coast. Certainly, you're not going to tell me that the urban market has nothing to do with white people. If you're talking about a city like Chicago that has an area that's clearly identified as the Gold Coast, high incomes, white people, the same thing happens in New York and in LA. And it happens in these major urban centers across major city centers across the country. And so my point is just to draw our attention to how these kinds of things are evidences or are indexing a deep, deep, deep racial socialization that we often are not questioning, we're not aware of. We're just going along, whether in labor or in our own personal lives, with the racialized social mechanisms that we're handed. And so that's the only thing I wanted to add, is that the complexity of what's happening topographically in urban places and the complexity that's happening topographically in rural places, if we're going to really talk about place, right? It gets thrown into this nonsense pattern because of racialization and our social understandings and logics around race.
I've regrouped, thanks.
Are you feeling okay?
Good sinusitis, right? Only other thing I was just going to say is that Carol is right in saying that there are some unique features, though, of rural life, and but in places like rural areas of Michigan, you see people having some of the same issues, around race, because urban can be deconstructed as well. Mm-hmm. My early work actually looked at a rural area and in South Carolina and the directions that people went into. And I think Carol's earlier point about poor white kids in those areas is a point well taken. We saw, when I did 4 generations of families in those areas, the Black families were far more successful, as it turns out, according to Western notions of academic and human success, than the white families who were in those same areas. Not because they had more money, but as Carol said earlier, the idea of resistance had permeated their very being, and they had decided that they were going to be able to achieve. They understood that they could not continue to be in that rural space in a place, in a way that was similar to the enslavement of their ancestors. And so they did, they did very well. But when we talked to folks in those areas, the thing that was striking to me was that the white residents really did not think that they were worse off. They still had a sense of their power, and they also had a sense of their superiority as a function of being white.
So given everything that we've talked about, I'm looking at the time. You guys have put so much wonderful material out there for everyone to reflect on. I want to at least take the last few seconds and ask if anyone who's listening, who's still here listening to us, wish to respond to anything. This is probably your time to do that before we close down.
Before we go, I want to thank everyone, those who are here, who came and listened to us, and to Gwen and these panelists. This is an intergenerational panel, so of course I love it. I think the fact that people have stayed on have really kind of, in many cases, there was a bearing of souls in the chat, the degree to which I could read them. And so I hope we have the impetus to move and make the change, understanding that the power is within us and it's within LRA to make a difference in the fight for social justice.
Now, out of pure selfish reasons, I have one question that I'm just curious to know the answer to, because it's specifically speaking to the two male members on our panel. And it says, please talk about your specific experiences as a Black man in relation to Black Lives Matter.
You first, Vaughn.
That's heavy. So, I'm just going to share the experience of first of all, I just appreciate the conversation, the opportunity to be in conversation with folks and to see folks today. And I mean, I think that question, it just compels me to think about this summer. And going right back to May. And so thinking with, so I taught in Brooklyn. So I live not far from, my kids grew up not far from Central Park. And so, the week of and the experience of and having to just recalling what it meant to have to be in conversation, the challenge of having to be in conversation again with my kids, and thinking of the experience of folks bird watching in Central Park, and then that followed up with George Floyd, and having to have the conversation yet again of that this could be, right, me or your Uncle Victor or your Uncle Vance, Grandpop. And so I'm just compelled to be in, to do the work and to be in the work. And I appreciate the question. I think that right, as the son of a Black woman, right, as the father of Black children, I'm just thinking urgently with what it means as a starting point to really take this moment as a community to and this is in this time this summer when I thought through this notion of historicizing, contextualizing, affirming, and building with, and just what it means in this moment to deeply do the work of wanting to urgently build with folks who've come before us, but also knowing that, as you know, even in my case as a teacher of 12 years, as now a literacy researcher, what does it mean to step aside and to really deeply lead with and build with, whether it's the creative and artistic literacy practices and artifacts of our young Black men, in my case, who I'm working with, and then again when we're doing the work of doing the work of our, when we're then doing the work of our analysis and sharing with our pre-service teachers and that sort of thing. What does it mean to think about frameworks that theorize folks' practices in ways that they seek to be in conversation about those, in ways that deeply affirm folks' identities and as a starting point. So thank you for the question. I mean, it's hard to note how that question is ever present. It's not a question that I'm going to easily, turn off and move from. And it's with all of us. So yeah, I'll just pause there.
What I just remembered is that I wrote a piece in 2016 that got published in the Black History Bulletin, and I think the way I'm going to answer you is by bringing just going to read aloud the last couple of sections of that. So with this second perspective of Black education crisis in mind, it becomes obvious why, yet again, we are faced with the need to exclaim Black Lives Matter. It should come as no surprise that the organization of schools and classrooms, the instructional practices therein, and the resources and materials apportioned to places raised as Black would produce pipelines to prison and poverty. Given the innumerable artifacts, institutions, and ideologies derived from Western Europeans' invention and exploitation of race, we who are raised as Black fully expect to fight philosophically, epistemologically, theologically, theoretically, hermeneutically, linguistically, economically, politically, interpersonally, intrapersonally, and with our own colored clenched hands to protect our humanity, the humanity of our children, our loved ones, and our communities. For many persons raised as Black in the US, this is the American way. Our present times have shown us yet again that we have a choice to make. Will we choose to orient ourselves to race as common sense, reading the written word and the unwritten world only according to white, superordinate, Western European design? Or will we choose the post-white orientation, wherein we are critically aware of the consequential discourses that metaphorically and quite literally writes the codes of the racialized matrix in which we live and according to which we die? And so I think that is the best response that I could give on the moment, because that, as I said before, for many persons raised as Black in the US, is the American way, is how we have managed to navigate, protect our lives, protect the lives of those we love and those who love us, to nurture ourselves, to carry forward generations and traditions and cultural artifacts and cultural heritages that have literally meant the difference between life and death. And so I think my best, response as a Black man to what we mean, or what I think we mean by Black Lives Matter, is that you're not going to kill us and get to write the story as if it was our fault. If you do manage to get away with it, which I don't think you will, but if you do manage to get away with it, we're not going silently. We're going to go out fighting to the very end.
I know we're supposed to be at a town hall, but I think Daryl Hux is still here and he's supposed to be the moderator. So do you want to say anything in terms of the town hall? I apologize for taking longer, but I really didn't want to shut this down. This is exactly the kind of conversation that I think we've been needing to have.
I
So,
say
Daryl?
something. I would love to say something. Thank you first to the. I would love to say something in response to the question that was asked as a Black male.
Yes.
So for me, growing up in a family that was loving, nurturing, and supportive, this Black Lives Matter, the message was never for us. We knew that already, right? I grew up knowing that I matter, right? Knowing that the people that raised me, the people that loved me, the people that hoped for me, the people that dreamed for me, that they mattered, right? And so it was always something, it's a wake-up call for folks who don't understand that. It's a wake-up call for folks on the outside of us, right? But we have always known that we've mattered, right? That's how we survived. That's how, in my case, a little boy who grew up in the Bronx in New York is now teaching in rural New Hampshire, right? That I have grown up knowing that Black people, we can occupy space anywhere and everywhere, right? My father instilled that in me. He told me, Black people, you will find us everywhere. We are everywhere. Now, whether or not other people want to recognize us, I was taught, don't let that be your problem, that be their problem. So that's one thing that I try to do with my students. That's something that I share with the teachers that I'm working with, to get them to understand that those Black and brown students that you're working with, if you are a white female, that there are people that love them, that care about them, that hope for them and dream for them as well. And that you need to get on board with that.
Thank you for sharing and taking the time to share with us. Daryl, what do you want to do?
I want to keep going.
Okay.
This conversation to keep, this is the town hall.
You want this to turn into the town hall?
This is the town hall. I think, Gwen, how do you want us to move forward? We can
This
shift.
is the town hall.
Yeah, this is
Let's
the town
seize
hall.
the moment, like really. How many times have we tried to have these conversations and haven't been able to do it? Let's just continue. Feel free to raise your hand and ask a question or, make a comment. Let's interact. This is perfect.
Yeah.
As Dr. Lee said yesterday, let's just go with the flow.
Roll with it. I'm just looking to see if anyone.
Excuse me as I shift into my town hall mode. I'm no longer on the panel.
Yeah. All right, while we're waiting, I have a question. How can we build allyship with other racialized scholars, Native American, Latinx, Asian, as well as white scholars and professionals?
Well, first, I strongly believe that if, as social scientists thinking about learning and development, we have a particular lens around literacy, but it's still situated in the broader context of human learning and diversity. The extent to which, one, we have more direct collaborations will certainly lead to that. But if we can sort of situate it in, so there's one of these chats was asking about the relationship between scholarship and activism. So I'd like just to relate my comment to that. So a man named Donald Stokes wrote a book years ago called Postur's Quadrant, in which he talked about different kinds of research. This is in the quote unquote hard sciences, some of which were just basic research. But then there was something that he called, what he ended up calling Postures Quadrant, where the aim of the research was both to understand fundamental principles about some scientific phenomena, but in terms of their usefulness in creating, better, in Postures case, better, health opportunities for human beings. And so if our work in these various ethnic communities, I'm not calling them racial communities, I'm calling them ethnic communities. And I say ethnicity because national borders change. Spain didn't become a nation until 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Italy didn't become a nation until well after that. You can think about the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the countries that have been emerging, and what those countries were based on are ethnic groups that had been forced inside of the nation state of the Soviet Union. And these ethnicities persist longer than nationalities, nation states do. And so it seems to me that if we can begin to work collaboratively, where what we're trying to understand are the regularities of patterns of human learning, perceptions matter, emotions matter, relationships matter, social organization of settings matter, where in the life course you are, where in historical time things are occurring. This, ecological kind of systems thinking in terms of dynamic studies of complex dynamic systems, which very few people in literacy deal with, where you are trying to understand how the interacting elements of a system interact and where inserting particular shifts in something or another in the system can completely reorganize it. So we're trying to understand underlying patterns in literacy, how you learn to read, comprehend, write, understand disciplinary text, media, whatever the case, object of literacy might be on the one hand, but at the same time knowing that in order for the science to have explanatory power, it has to be able to account for the diversity of ways in which human beings organize both individually. Those of us who have children and have more than one child, I have 3 children, they all came out of my body and my husband's, whatever. He contributed, I carried them. They're only 2 years apart. There are aspects of them that are part of being in the Matabuti family, right? That are similar, but they're also completely different as individuals, right? So a very complex thing about trying to understand human learning and development. And I'm just suggesting if we can have a broader frame where literacy is an instance of a particular kind of learning, it is not an end in and of itself, it serves a function, right? That the work that we do across these ethnic communities, if we work in collaboration, can have a powerful impact and a basic understanding of human functioning, because it can show you the variety of ways in which literacy can be, developed, right? So children of the people who do work around what they call translanguaging, children who have one language at home and another language at school, and all the meta-knowledge about language that children develop. Well, you can't take that and say, well, the child who then grows up in a monolingual home somehow is deficient. He just has a different set of resources. So I think one is we have to build, and this is something else LRA could do, build structures to facilitate advocate to IES and NSF and various, foundations to support work of scholars working in different ethnic communities around common things that we want to understand about literacy development, for example. But being able to situate that into not there's this story and this story and this story, and then we competing over who got the best story, but say there's some convergence across this line of research that unfolds the multiple pathways through which learning and development occur. And this, what I'm talking about here is cutting edge work. It isn't the multicultural work. I'm all in favor of that. Jim Banks, one of my best friends, right? But this whole thing of we're going to give you space. You do your thing and you do your thing and your stuff's all right. It ain't the real thing, but we'll give you some space, you know, to think about your little thing. Versus saying all these different ways of engaging with the artifacts and the organization of social settings that promote the development of literacy in the broadest sense expands the way in which we can think about creating opportunities for the maximum number of children, and we have a better foundational understanding. I'm saying that the situation, this is about science, but at the same time understand no matter how well we situate this work in terms of science, I think it was Marcus maybe or Vaughn was talking about, you know, it was a whole long history of work in literacy that supports everything we're talking about, is not the same thing as influencing policy. That's a different order, because those folks are not working on the basis of research and empirical findings. They don't care what it is.
For me, adding what Dr. Lee just said, it goes back to my humanity point. So if we look at this from a humanity stance and we look at history and we think about how the indigenous Americans helped enslaved Africans escape from slavery, right? So all the way to the present, how Black Lives Matter protesters were out at the Dakota pipelines. So we have to look at this as not like an issue for a certain racial group, but this impacts all of us and how we come together to fight against the systems that are in place.
Any other comments? Let's look and see if I have any other questions here. One question is, how do we prevent the marginalization of Blackness in space that are portended to be anti-racist, pro-Black?
We do this in the academy all the time. Virtually no institutions, unless we're in historically Black colleges or tribal colleges, for example, where we're not up against very subtle forms of racism. And a lot of what's happening in, you know, the broader Black Lives Movement that's occurring on college campuses, where students are pushing against the stories that the universities want to tell themselves about what they represent and what their, you know, their history is. We're having this current battle in an interesting way at Northwestern University. And one of the things I've often said is Northwestern's in Evanston, the major street that runs through it is Sheridan, named after that dude who was the governor, whatever, who said, you know, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. There's no thought whatsoever about what that means. And I always would tell students when I was there, said if it had been named Hitler Road, people would have had a hissy fit for what it symbolizes. But there's so many ways in which institutions, and for that matter, organizations that see themselves as progressive, if you will, you know, fighting anti-Blackness, I still have to keep coming back to this original comment that I keep coming back to. A major, major task and challenge we have for all of us is to really begin to interrogate, what is this ideology of white supremacy? A powerful book on this is Charles Mills' The Racial Contract, right? And that is especially challenging now versus say 50 years ago or 100 years ago, because it's all so subtle and it's all so normalized. The term, you know, I always raise questions when people talk about people of color. People of color, from my perspective, is a term that emerges out of this ideology of white supremacy, because it means there's colored people and then there's the real people. The fact of the matter is all human beings have color. There are no white human beings and there are no black human beings. All human beings have different degrees of melanin that range from a very light cream to a deep, beautiful chocolate, right? And so that's what I'm, we use this, people of color, this, and black and brown people. And every time we use it, we are subtly reinforcing there's the human beings, the white people, and then there's the people of color, the other kind of thing. And it's all made up. And we don't understand what we subtly reinforce every time we use it. Let's talk about the cream people and the beige people and the chocolate brown people, if we're going to use that as the criteria. And once you do that, then what about the Pakistan? I remember I was in Pakistan. Was it Pakistan or Malaysia? I don't remember. But I'm in this international airport and I'm looking at the people standing in line and they're all this beautiful deep chocolate brown, right? I don't know what they become when they come to the United States. You know what I mean? But they ain't people of African descent.
And I just want to add to that the point that she's making is not a new point, and yet it sounds like a comment from the year 3000 for most people to hear what she just said, because our day-to-day lives are so far removed from that realization, which is something that's been established for a very, very long time. I mean, to say that there is no trace of race in the human body, again, sounds like a comment from from the year 3000, when that's not something that we haven't known. So the reason why I bring that point up and I kind of further highlight what she's saying there is because what racial literacies is about, in a sense, not fully, but I want to be simple to make sure everybody's hearing me. How do we navigate the racialization in which we find ourselves, not being trapped by it, not continuing to perpetuate it for the ends to which they were set forth, but at the same time, not denying that our ordinary day-to-day life functions according to that logic. So when I go and when I have a baby at the hospital, you fill out the papers. They're gonna have a racial classification section when you fill out those papers to prepare to take your child home. And if you don't fill the papers out, they don't let you leave. When you go get a license, right? When you register your child for school, when they come to you for the census, no matter how much they change or don't change the census categories, they're gonna be there, right? So we have created the world along these lines now, and we've so deeply structured and constructed the world in racialized terms that we can't reject it outright in terms of our ordinary day-to-day living existence, but we must critique it. We must push back on it and question it, interrogate it, to not let it continue to do the thing that it's been doing to get us here. And so all that is a long way of saying that's what I'm inviting all of us to do. How do we understand how to navigate and engage the racialization in which we find ourselves, that we are forced to reckon with? You don't have a choice individually. You may not like it. You may wish it were otherwise, but you are in context. You are in community. You are in a situation that is not fully your making, and you're not fully determined by it either, but you do have to figure out how to navigate it. And so racial literacies, in a simple way to put it, is about how do we live our lives in racialization and keep human well-being as the goal and the aim. How do we participate in racialization for human well-being as opposed to participating in racialization for human harm? And so that's the challenge as I look back on the literature. we've had all these brilliant insights and breakthroughs and realizations for a very, very long time. But how do we ethically do race? Because and this is where it gets, to be what I refer to as the three basic ways of thinking about it. You have the white deficiency, racist kind of understanding, that kind of an approach to race. When you become aware of that, you don't want to have anything to do with it. And typically the first response is post-racialism, where I don't see race, I don't see color, right? But there's another option. You can become post-white, as I argue. So it's not about post-racialism, and it's certainly not about perpetuating racists and racism. It's about putting race in the place it belongs and keeping human well-being as the priority, despite the racialization that we're now at this point in human history, we're forced to deal with. As Black people, as white people, as whatever you regard yourself as racially, we are now at this point in human history, we have to navigate it.
Well, I think we've always, I hate to keep them, we've had to navigate it since it came into being. And I want to keep emphasizing that it is new in human history. It seemed like a long time to us, but it's new in human history. And what it is a political category. It has political consequences, right? And there are many ways in which we learn. I think the heart of what I think you're arguing are the complex ways in which we need to learn how to interrogate it and to understand it as a system, but not an indicator of the internal processes of humans. Humans have all kinds of things in systems that we have to learn how to navigate, right? But I also think that we have some interesting opportunities in the ways in which we use language. So I can remember when, if you look in terms of issues around gender and sexuality, the evolution of language for talking about it has evolved over time. And the new thing where, in your email, you put his or him or her or they, that I was thinking of an interesting little story. My granddaughter, one of my granddaughters is lesbian. She was living with her partner and they broke up, and she was talking with me about her partner and she was saying they, and I thought it meant that her partner was having an affair, and that was the problem. She was talking about her gendered identity. And the use of that, the way in which that language has been taken up forces people to rethink, what do we mean when we talk about gender and sexual orientation? Similarly, in the so-called community around disabilities, and people are pushing back about the use of the term disabled as opposed to diverse, right? And if you think in terms of the history of Black people, we saw ourselves as particular kinds of Africans, Akan, Yoruba, etc. Then we got to be colored, then we got to be Negro. But the push for the term for Black and African American came from within the community. And that shift to African American, you know what I'm saying? It opened up a whole new way of possibilities to say, well, what is that we have in common? We have in common that you can go anywhere in the world where you have a significant community of people of African descent, and you're going to find a whole set of shared cultural practices that get passed on. People can't even name it what they are, but they are so powerful that you're going to find them all over the world, because these ethnic practices sustain communities over time and people pass them on from one generation to the next. So my only point about part of what I keep pushing back are the ways in which, Maulana Quraysh, I don't use slave. I take enslaved person. That means the slave was not a status within the person. It was a condition that was imposed on them. In a similar vein, I don't use slave owners. I say people who thought that they owned other human beings. And that transformation of language, especially with social media and the like, just begins to sort of push the boundary subtly of saying, maybe some assumptions we made really don't hold up.
Clearly, we can have this conversation all night. I'm not going to do that to you. But I do have one question that I would like each of you to answer before we close, and this is really the last one that we will entertain tonight. And I think we'll close the town hall. And Daryl, you're invited to answer it as well if you would like. So COVID-19 has emphasized many disparities. How can we utilize this period in education to do what President Betsy Baker talked about yesterday, to help Black children travel digitally across time and space? The digital divide is real. So we can start with, I'm looking at my screen, so I can just start with the first person I see. So I can start with Carol and make my way across the images that I see, and we'll end in that way. Carol, you want to start us off?
Well, I think that there are fascinating opportunities around these artifacts of digital media that in many instances we don't fully understand. A whole lot of kids have cell phones, and they do things with those cell phones that we older people do not know and do not understand. I'm at my son's house. I had to go into quarantine and get to COVID so I could see my grandkids for a little while. This 2-year-old can take his other grandmother is here. He gets that iPad. He wants the iPad, and he can go to Netflix and this. He but 2 years old, nobody taught him anything. So I think that what COVID has done on so many levels, I think, is to make very visible the many inequities along so many dimensions that existed before the COVID, before the virus spread. But I also want to say at the same time, these tools offer some very interesting opportunities for creativity. And the question is the extent to which schools and teachers sort of understand that, and understanding, just as we've been talking about with everything else, there's so many ways in which the young people who in this current narrative wants to say the kids are, they don't have the internet or whatever, they don't have this, they can't do that. If you look at them outside of school, what they do with digital media, what they create, and Instagram and memes, whatever stuff I don't even understand, is extraordinarily powerful. And I think we ought to, the same perspective that we've been talking about in terms of understanding assets, is to say this is a whole world of youth engagement with digital media, often outside of the context of schooling, that we don't thoroughly understand as resources.
Okay. Kamania, what are your thoughts on this?
I think that, as Dr. Lee was saying, that COVID really just made a spotlight on the disparities that already existed. But I think that news and media are really paying attention to it now because we have no option. So thinking about food, and not just access to Wi-Fi, but like food insecurity. I remember a CNN reporter was talking about like, he was in New York City and he was comparing the COVID rates in like, I guess like Manhattan compared to Queens, right? So we're talking about social class right now. And he's like, I'm not sure why, the numbers are low in Manhattan, but when we go to Queens, they're high. And I'm like, duh, like, let's look at social income. Let's look at racial, like, let's look at race, So it's like, duh, how do you not know? So I think that this really just gave us an opportunity to see what is broken in this country, right? When we look at the long lines for the food pantry, when we think about who gets to work from home and who doesn't have a choice and they have to use public transportation to get to work, when we think about who has access to healthcare and who doesn't, and then we even think about the vaccine, like what communities are being pushed to take the vaccine first, right? So it's going to take so much more than just looking at who has access to Wi-Fi. I think that what we should be looking at when we're talking about schools, because I'm working with teachers, is like, and they have to test. They're still testing these kids, these first graders, these kindergartners, and it's just like, why are we still thinking about testing? Capitalism. Like, so it's just like, can we just pause for this school year and take it as, let's worry about the whole child? How are they being fed? If they're not being fed as a school, how can we use our school buses to distribute food? So our focus needs to be less on capitalism ideals and more on the whole child, and not just Wi-Fi, because that is an issue. And Wi-Fi at this point, we realize the importance of it, and it should be like healthcare. It should be something that everyone has access to. So I hope I answered the question.
Thank you for that. Marcus, would you like to share with us your thoughts?
Yeah, so I have to bring attention to the way that the typical orientation to race will see high COVID numbers among some, particularly Black folks who are raised as Black, is how I talk about it, to pick up Dr. Lee's point. What I do, let me do a little small digression and come right back. One of the things I work very hard at with everything that I publish is to write in ways that demystify and expose the game, so to speak, so that you'll see me say things like those who are regarded as Black, or in schools regarded as urban, to show openly that there's a process at work. There's something being done. It's not just there in the world naturally in and of itself. And so along those same lines, when we think about how we can look at a set of statistics, we can look at counts of who has internet access. We can look at counts of who tested positive for COVID. We can look at counts of who has diabetes and all these kinds of things. And if we're not careful, that will become evidence of the Black pathology, of the degradation of the Black racial categorization, rather than evidence of what we have done to create that kind of situation. Because, and I talked about this briefly in my dissertation, you have to work hard to get the fact of human variety, the fact of human diversity. You have to work hard to make that into a pattern. Like, there's no reason, there's so much variation. I mean, we look at things like our fingerprints. It's not duplicated from human to human, even if the human is your parent or your sibling, right? I mean, there's so many, our DNA pattern, certainly broadly speaking, is a lot of similarity, but then they find that there are some differences that make the difference between not gender, but between having a certain type of body in terms of reproduction, or another type of body in terms of not being able to do reproduction. My point is, we have all these reasons why there should not be the kind of patterns we're talking about. It shouldn't make a difference whether or not you're classified as Black in America with regard to a virus. Like, that doesn't make any sense. There is no reason for if you're a part of what it means to be a human being in this time, it should not matter what your racial categorization is, because every human being, as we can see it at this point, to some degree, is susceptible to the virus, right? But if you don't have a certain way of thinking about it, all that data does is become another confirmation of what it was you had in mind to begin with. And so that's what I want to raise about the digital divide, about the effects of COVID. If we're not reoriented in our racial orientation and how we think, and what we believe is going on and how it got to be this way, we'll look at all these data that should be telling us that we have a great deal of work to do, and we'll see that as confirmation of, yes, yet again, another reason why these folks over there should be written off. And so that's the thing that worries me, is how many people are not in this conversation tonight, and so let me back up one more time. So you have the early phase, if you remember, the early stages of COVID hitting the United States in particular, everybody was scared. Everybody was concerned, right? At first, we started seeing a lot of white folks who were having trouble with COVID, right? Then the data started to accumulate and the news story started changing. And the news story started being about, oh, well, actually, it seems like white folks are doing fine with COVID. It's the Black people, it's the brown people, it's the this and the that. And now the whole narrative shifts over so that we have a different kind of mindset around what COVID is about and who it's important to protect. Whereas when we didn't have a way of understanding who was or who wasn't vulnerable to it, we had a very different news cycle around it, very different imagination around it. And so, again, I raise that point as a concrete example for how we have certain ways of thinking and certain ways of understanding each other and understanding ourselves in terms of racial logics that are, horribly recreated and perpetuated, even with the thing we call data, even with the stuff we regard as being good science. If we're not dealing at the philosophical level, I already understand where you're going to play out theoretically and even to some extent methodologically. I already know kind of what you're going to find if I got a sense of where you're coming at, how you're coming at this philosophically in terms of what do you believe about human beings? What do you believe about what it means to be human? Who's counted and regarded as human and having human capacities, fully human capacities, right? Because there was a whole argument for a period of time in terms of, now I'm going to tie it specifically to literacy and literacy research. There was the written out belief that it was not possible for a person of African descent to be what we regarded at that time as literate, to use the arts and sciences as in a more archaic way of talking about it, right? So if you go around in the world believing that because of my racial classification, I don't even have the capacity for this thing called being literate, reading and writing and so forth, well, that has real implications for what happens if you show up to teach me something, or if you feel it's a waste to provide materials to me, and all these other things that we have a clear record for as shows indeed it was all wrong, it was all a lie from the very beginning. So that's all to say, I'm worried about how we are approaching whatever outcome data that we have, whatever counts we're using, whatever descriptions we're using, however whatever your methodological approach. I want to know, what do you believe about human beings with regard to the racialization that we're still all having to navigate and think through?
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Gaston, what are your thoughts?
Okay. Well, first I want to thank Marcus and Kamania and Carol. So, I've thought a lot about this digital issue. And the other day, one of my students said that a quarter of the students in Los Angeles have not logged on. So that means there is school happening, but they're doing something else. And it just made me, really think about these high expectations that we had for a digital world. And even when COVID started, people thought, well, we'll learn how to do some things differently, not always thinking about the limitations of, or the limited access that some people have to Wi-Fi. And they have limited access to Wi-Fi because they lived in neighborhoods that are low income and don't have access, don't have economic security as well. I think about the intersection of the personal and the academic. I think about that all the time. And where I live, I'm in my office at home. 10 blocks from where I am west, there is a high school that has had the lowest scores in the city of Philadelphia for several years. Next door to that school is a health center that's named after a physician who was a wonderful person here at the University of Pennsylvania's hospital. And I understand that they are so overwhelmed with the number of people coming in for test, and that they can't handle. I'm saying all this to say that we are in an incredibly precarious and what used to be called topsy-turvy time. Students are caught in the middle of this. We now know that simply having access to a computer is not enough, because when we look at what's happening to kids, it's also the stress of the times. We have a better sense, I think, because of COVID, and I hate to say because of COVID, because I would wish that it didn't exist, of just how severe the inequities are, and the injustices that are attached to that. While on the one hand, the students can do an incredible amount of work that, as Carol noted, I don't have the expertise to do. On the other, there aren't necessarily places and outlets for them to do some of that work. And so they're experiencing technology in a very traditional way, if they even have access to it. But I'm saying all that to say that, you know, as we move forward, I think we need to be more, we need to challenge the status quo quite a bit more. We need to think about what we're talking about when we have very interesting, but not necessarily inclusive projects around digital learning. How are we thinking about that? How are we thinking about that with selected populations of kids? What does it mean for access? Does not necessarily mean full access to the full range of properties that digital learning can offer. It means that you have some access. And so I'm just hopeful that this digital, that the degree to which COVID has brought about increased knowledge about inequities across the board, as Kamani said, food insecurities, a lot of other insecurities. We have food lines here in Philadelphia. We understand all of those issues as interlocking, and the digital divide being a kind of public representation of the embedded inequities in our society. I think an organization like LRA can think about alliances that it can make. Carol talked earlier about placing ourselves in policy circles and making sure that we have good data and strong statements, and as well as strong ideologies about what matters and what's just, that we are positioned to move these conversations forward and do it without fear.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Vaughn, would you like to get in and share some of your thoughts too?
Sure. I think I was thinking with the notion of the point you shared regarding how Black children traveling when you noted Black children traveling digitally across time and space. And I think that just really resonated in thinking about, so, I mean, I think I'm feeling compelled in some ways to frame my response with Lamar Johnson, my colleague at MSU, and his colleagues who built with Joyce King, and thinking about this notion of a pedagogy of love. Mm-hmm. And so the components involving, points such as eldering, communal ways of knowing, culturally authentic notions of assessment and locating students where they are. And those are points that I think with, when I think about youth and Black children traveling digitally across time and space, and putting that in conversation with this notion of students whose school in the context of attending in person wasn't working well for folks. Mm-hmm. So perhaps, what's the opportunity? What's our opportunity to think broadly with methodological approaches and frameworks that imagine or reimagine what it means to envision school differently? And so I think this flows from curriculum patterns to our teaching practices to the physical school space. Can we envision a space where when the schools reopen, does everyone want to return to that space? Schooling now, the space of schooling now is perhaps a home space with siblings, families, extended families, aunties, elders. And so I guess I'm also noting, thinking with Black children traveling digitally across time and space, like, I think that I'm thinking of gaming as one example, and ways in which folks through gaming as a literacy practice, right, extend identities, right, deeply demonstrate, language and learning practices. There's a particular mobile, I guess it would be a mobile game, a gaming app from Lawal Mayan. He's from Sudan. He composed a video game available as a mobile app. I'm thinking of an Xbox game. I think it's available on Xbox and other places. It's called Never Alone. And it's specifically the gamers went to the elders and elders and storytellers and community members during gameplay. Oftentimes during gameplay, you unlock the next level or a new accessory or something like that. In this game called Never Alone, during gameplay, the storyteller narrates the gamer's journey as Nuna with her Arctic fox companion, and as the gameplay progresses, you gain access to video insights. So what you unlock when you get to that next level is a story from an elder about the community. And they share stories and wisdoms and those points. So what I'm thinking about when I think I just really just am building with when you shared, what does it mean for Black children traveling with and traveling digitally across time and space? I'm thinking, we have to engage the conversation, this challenge of school practices and types of literacy and digital literacy and learning that youth engage in ways that are deeply of interest, have that conversation in parallel and with that that policy level conversation around deep conversations around access. And what does that work mean as our ongoing work as a literacy research community?
Thanks for that, Vaughn. Daryl, would you like to get into the game?
Well, I would love to.
Okay.
I think on a practical level, when I think about working with the next generation of teachers, and when the pandemic happened, and I had students that mentioned that some students with children were not showing up, and so I asked them the question, well, tell me what you know about this student. And as it turns out, they didn't really know much about the student beyond who the student was in their classroom, right? And so there's an assumption there that we know children, that we have a relationship with them based upon a learned performance on their part, right? They're sort of a captive audience, children in schools often, right? And so we don't necessarily know what their lives are about. We don't know what their families are about. So when I ask those questions of my students, if a child doesn't show up, for me as an educator, the natural next step is to reach out to the family, right? Reach out to the community, go knock on a door. That was not the case for a number of the teachers, the young teachers that I was encountering. And so that means that we needed to have a different conversation, and I need to explain to them how much they did not know, right? That quote unquote really good relationship that they had was on the surface level. It was on the surface level and is based on a child's performance within the context of the school. We need to go beyond that, right? We really need to, we talk about caring and love and all of these different, sort of ideas that are out here now, right? And I think, how do we actually live that, right? It's one thing for me to say, I love you when you show up every day and you perform for me in a space that I'm in control of, right? Teachers have a lot of power in that space, that classroom space. So you show up every day, I teach you a set of things that I've decided. You don't have any input on any of it. I'm teaching the same thing that I taught the previous year to a different set of students. I'm teaching, again, the previous year to that one, different set of students, and I'm still doing the same things. And you are forced to mold yourself into the image that I have. There's no way in the world that anybody with any sense should say, I know that child. I know that child in this context. I don't know them outside in the world. I don't know what the stressors are in their lives. If there are stressors in their lives, I do think that sometimes we make the assumption that if a child does not show up or is not showing up for the technology classes, that somehow there's a deficiency on their part. Some of them are not showing up because they don't feel connected. And they don't, and oh my goodness, I'm finally away from this. I'm not going to show up. And they are engaging with the technology, as my colleagues have said on the panel, they are engaging in as innovative of a way as they can. And we need to rethink that. We're not engaging in really understanding children. We're not really understanding what they can do now. We're still stuck in this cycle of assumptions, right? Cycle of assumptions. It's sort of, I equate it to, I'm having a dinner party and my friend brings someone over to the dinner party and they sit down and they eat the meal. And after they leave, right, they didn't turn over the table or anything, but I turn around to someone else and say, oh, I know that person so well. I don't know them so well. I know that they have on a basic level that they have some understanding that there's food on the table, that someone brought them there and they may have been hungry. They're going to eat the food. I don't know anything about their lives beyond that. We really need to think about how we know and understand the lives of the children, the families, the communities that we're serving. We really need to rethink that.
I think that's a great note, a great point to end our conversation, because it really, at the end of the day, is about human beings. And that's what we're hearing, right? Recognizing human beings that are before us, hearing what people are really saying when they're speaking to us, and getting off script, getting outside of our boxes. It's a call for all of us. So it's not just about one group or another group, it's a call for all of us. And so I want all of you, if you wouldn't mind humoring me, to go ahead and take your mute buttons off.
Yes.
And please thank these wonderful panelists for all of what they've done. They went beyond the call of duty for us.
Yes. Awesome.
All that hard work that they put forward. You know, originally
Thank you.
it was to be an hour and a few minutes, maybe. Turned out to be a lot longer, but it also shows the need, right?
Yes.
The need to have these conversations. And I hope that it will be a starting point and we will continue to have these conversations. So I want to wish all of you a great night, and thank you again, panelists, for all that you do and for sharing with us.
And thank you, Yuri, and every one of the panelists, Carol, Kamania, Marcus, Daryl, Vivian, and Vaughn. I am so grateful to be sharing this time and space with you, as well as all of you who stayed, those who had to leave. Thank you. And we only have 12 more minutes for Afterglow. So I'm going to say, let's just shut it down for the night. We have so much to think about. Let's just, you know, shut down our computers and reflect on this rich conversation. I appreciate all of you, and I will see you in the morning at Coffee Cafe. Thank you, headquarters. Thank you, Shock Logic. Thank all of you.
Thank you, Gwen.
Congratulations, Gwen.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Outstanding.
Yes, thank you. Sending virtual hugs to everybody.
Yes.
Good night.
Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you. Thank you, Daryl. Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.